So happy to have you here. I know that many of you saw the treats in the back. Please don't be shy. We've got plenty of coffee, and the cookies are all from Old Town, so you know they're good and buttery. So enjoy. Again, we're so happy to have you, and we're so happy to have this partnership with Augustana College. And I'm going to welcome our speaker to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, the non-speaker.
The non-speaker to the speaker.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you. And thank you all for coming today. We're having a little conversation over here. I just realized for some people, this may be your first time in the Rock Island Public Library. If this is your first time, if you don't mind, raise your hand. We'd like to know who you are. Well, thank you so much for coming. We want you to know what a special place you're in right now. So around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, lots of towns were getting libraries funded by a guy named Andrew Carnegie, who was a very rich person in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he gave a lot of money to towns all over the place to build libraries. And there's one in Moline. You can see a downtown Moline, a Carnegie Library. Some of you may have hometowns that have Carnegie libraries. But the way the story goes here is that when the folks from Rock Island reached out to Andrew Carnegie, he said, any town that's got Fred Weyerhaeuser doesn't need me. And thank heavens, because Fred Weyerhaeuser was a truly wealthy individual, and he largely funded the construction of this building when it opened in 1903. The Frieze Lecture Series is a celebration of this building and its history, because around the frieze of the building are carved the names of great writers, canonical writers from different cultures. And I hope you get a chance to sometime just take a look at all those names. Anyway, that's your Rock Island history for today. This actually is another great bit. This was painted by a person who was on the faculty at Augustana named Ben Jasper. And these are buildings that were part of the college's history done in a really interesting style. You can learn more about it right over there. Anyway, today we're talking about art. This series is, of course, about death. That most universal human experience that sooner or later all of us must confront through four lenses. And because today's lens is art, I wanted some of my favorite artists represented. So I'm wearing a tie featuring a work by Gustav Klimt. I'm wearing, if you're really sharp-eyed, I can show you this later, a lapel pin honoring the artist Egon Schiele, who was an Austrian expressionist and a fave of mine. And not to leave the textile arts out, I actually have socks knitted by my favorite textile artist, my spouse. Anyway, with that setup, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Margaret Morse. Margaret Morse did her undergraduate work at Temple, and then she got to do some graduate work at the University of Maryland. But I don't know of any, this might be a challenge to all the students in the audience today. I don't know anybody who's done more cool internships and fellowships than Margaret Morse. She did one at the Met. She did one at the National Gallery of Art. She did one at a Guggenheim Institute in Venice. So that's your aspiration. That's what you should be shooting for right there. But one of the great things that's often an unsung attribute of Augustana College is we get really cool people to make Rock Island their home. And one of the coolest is my colleague, Professor and Chair of Art History at Augustana College, Dr. Margaret Morse.
Can you hear me? All right, well, thank you, Kai, for that really lovely introduction. And yes, I'm very glad to be a resident of Rock Island. So thank you all so much for coming here, especially the Augustana students who I think were forced to be here. I'm looking at you. But I still appreciate you being here. Thank you so much, Kai, for organizing this series and coming up with this cool theme appropriate for this time of year, I think. And thanks so much to the staff at Rock Island Library and helping get me set up. So I have to admit that I do kind of find the task of talking about death and the artist to be a bit daunting. And I thought, well, my colleagues must be feeling the same way, those who are also speaking in this series. But then I came and I heard Jane Rose's talk last week, and she was so focused and like on point, and my talk may be a little bit all over the place. So just a little warning. But because it's a bit overwhelming because the history of art is intimately associated with death. Since perhaps the first images on walls of caves, humans have grappled with their mortality through visual and material means. Sorry, there we go. That's how I want to get it down. Okay, so a universal fact of life, death has been the frequent subjects of works of art in both literal and symbolic ways. Moreover, Cultures from around the globe typically utilize crafted objects and images to protect, or at least try to protect, individuals and communities from death. Artistic items also serve as a central component in funerals and burials to honor the deceased. And ancient Egypt, I think, is perhaps the best known of these examples. So beliefs in they are part of these burials, and then beliefs in the afterlife amongst many cultures have necessitated that these items typically remained with the deceased in their tombs for perpetual use, even though today we commonly find such items on display in museums. Art can also play a commemorative role, providing a lasting remembrance of an individual or groups of individuals after their passing. So portraiture and monuments are just two examples of this commemorative function in Western art. So my talk today will be a broad overview of some of these aforementioned connections between art and death over time and across cultures, but so as not to overwhelm you with examples or go well beyond the time limit, I decided to focus my talk on examples from the collection of Augustana Center for Visual Culture. And Kai kind of gave me this idea. When he approached me to give this talk, Kai mentioned a work that we have in our collection that I'll actually show you today, so that was kind of the inspiration. So my presentation is therefore by no means exhaustive, but I think these examples demonstrate not just how artists have represented death over the years, but the critical role art has played in helping individuals and audiences process death, remember and commemorate the deceased, and honor their accomplishments and beliefs. So what I offer today is a sampling of the different, but I think we'll maybe find similar, ways that various cultures across time have grappled with death's inevitability in material and visual ways. So I'm starting with the ancient Greeks, and these are not works in our collection, I wish they were. So they're perhaps best known for classical architecture and idealized nude sculpted figures, but they also crafted truly remarkable pottery. And much of it was used in a funerary context. In the early geometric period, when these two vessels were made, wealthy families marked the tombs of their kin with massive vessels, and these are huge. So they're known as craters, and amphorae, that crater is about 4.5 feet high. The amphorae there, I should have a picture with people in it to give you a sense of scale, but that's about 5.5 feet high. So they would mark graves. It was a clear sign of status. And so they are enveloped with registers of profuse geometric decorations, and on careful inspection, one can observe that some of these shapes and patterns depict funerary rituals of mourning. So if you can kind of make out the deceased laid out on the funerary bier and attendants around. Over time, pottery associated with funerals in ancient Greece and its colonies became smaller, and much was buried with the deceased rather than marking their tombs. Artists substituted the repeated registers or bands of decoration for single scenes with more realistic imagery associated with death. On display in Augustana's permanent collection gallery below Centennial Hall is this fiale, a shallow, handleless dish used for libations or liquid offerings to gods and spirits of the dead. This particular fiale features a finely dressed, bejeweled female figure who appears to be running in haste. She holds and is surrounded by accoutrements associated with marriage. In her right hand, she balances a fiale, so it's kind of like the dish is represented in the image, and that contains ivy, a symbol of eternal life and fidelity. Her left hand grasps what's been identified as a garland of myrtle, a plant associated with Aphrodite. The scarf-like ribbon or fillet on the left-hand side of the image, so it seems to kind of hang in the air. They have multiple associations, but one of their functions is a kind of marker in sacred spaces to indicate a respectful approach to divinity. The star-like form to her left or our right, in other contexts, has stood for the evening star Hesperus, a harbinger of the wedding night. So she stands on a ground line that seems to separate her from some kind of void below. This fiale was made in Apulia, a region of southeastern Italy where the Greeks had established colonies in the first millennium BCE. Most Apulian pottery was made for funerary context and are found in tombs. And the theme of a young woman who dies on the brink of her wedding night was quite popular in literature from the time period when this dish was made. Professor Emeritus Thomas Banks thus concluded that this bride is moving quickly towards her premature death and a symbolic wedding to the god of the underworld. Perhaps this vessel was buried with a young woman who was betrothed but died before her earthly nuptials, or alternatively, the dish may have been used by the living to honor her brief life and ensure her spiritual union in the beyond. Another ceramic dish at Augustana from a funerary context, but from across the globe, is this Mayan polychrome tetrapod or four-legged plate, dating from around 6 to 900 CE, which is a time known as the late classical period in Mayan art. And I should probably have Jackson Payne come up and give a talk on this dish, because Jackson is currently doing some research on this particular vessel. So, like the Apulian fiale, the center of the dish bears an image that helps draw conclusions about the object's purpose. A crouching skeletal-like figure in profile likely refers to death. In the circular band surrounding the figure are glyphic markings that also bear meaning, which has been compared to similar types of Mayan vessels that have been found in graves. The four red pyramidal forms, I do have a pointer here, so these forms here in this outer band, they have been interpreted as water surfaces. The 5 vertical lines, not surprisingly, stand for the number 5, and the Mayan quincunx, as do the circular forms in the innermost band, so these forms here. The quincunx symbolizes the Mayan universe, with 1 point at the center and 4 at the cardinal directions. It represents the cosmos, with the center point acting as the axis connecting the earthly and celestial realms. The distinctive legs, these here, upon which the plate rests, mimic the snout and head of an agouti, a large rodent native to Central America that burrows under the Earth's surface for shelter. So we have all these layered associations to surfaces and passing between realms, which seems quite fitting for a vessel that may be associated with the tomb of a wealthy Mayan. We don't know the specific origin of this vessel, but polychrome ceramics have typically been found in elite burial contexts, where they once were used and then ritually interred. The bowl would thus provide an everlasting presence for the deceased in the afterlife, and perhaps even a means to communicate to the soul the path of its journey. So, jumping to another time and place, in Europe during the Middle Ages, Christianity was the dominant religion, and it was, and still is, a faith centered on the belief in the salvation of humans through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So over the course of the nearly 1,000-year span of the medieval period, the passion and crucifixion of Jesus became an increasingly popular subject in Christian art. Artists in the earlier medieval period tended to highlight the divine nature of Christ in crucifixion scenes through precious materials, perfected images of Christ's body, and even abstract imagery and symbols, such as the cross by itself. So this gorgeous cover of a gospel that is today in the Morgan Library is a great example of this emphasis more on the divinity of Christ. I mean, it's made completely of gold, and then we have all these gemstones that surround Jesus. But by the end of the Middle Ages, Jesus' human nature and suffering came to the fore in crucifixion scenes. This change in the representation of Jesus corresponded with a rise in personal devotion, accompanied by an increase in small-scale works of art to aid more individual prayers. An art form introduced during this time period to assist private devotion was the Book of Hours. Books typically small in scale, with prescribed sets of prayers to be said at particular times of the day. So many of them were small enough to carry in your hand, slip in a pocket. They were meant to be portable. Some of these books of hours, those of the wealthy aristocrats, were beautifully illustrated with images to help focus the meditations of the individual reciting the prayers. This folio at Augustana, created by a Parisian workshop in the 15th century, features the crucifixion of Christ in the top left, as you can see, whoops. And it's a page from one of these illuminated books of hours. Based on the accompanying text, we know that it marks the opening hours of the Holy Cross. So this would have been a prayer said at the later part of the day. The narrative of Christ's passion begins, however, in the lower right, this little scene here, with the scene of him carrying the cross and being pulled to Calvary by a man whose tongue lolls from his mouth, a marking of physical ugliness associated with spiritual disbelief. In the crucifixion scene, Christ's body hanging from the cross is marred and bloody, heightening his human suffering and allowing the viewer, who also likely witnessed much disease and pain and death in a period of repeated bouts of the plague and other illnesses, they would be able to connect viscerally and emotionally with the divine and put their own pain and experiences with loss in perspective. The floral imagery that grows across the page, enhanced with touches of gold leaf, may allude to the hopes for regeneration and salvation made possible by Christ's sacrifice. So medieval books of hours, they were manuscripts, most of them, and that means that each is a unique hand-produced object, so there's only one. Even though there were many, many books of hours, they were all distinct and different. One of the hallmarks of the Renaissance was the introduction of printmaking in Europe. This had a profound impact on the spread of ideas as well as imagery. Reproducible works of art on paper meant that a broader range of individuals could access and own works of art. Christian themes, including imagery of the death and suffering of Christ, as we just saw, they continued to dominate in Europe. Images of saints were also popular as divine yet accessible figures who performed miracles and achieved sanctity, often by dying for the faith. So the stories of saints were truly the stuff of legends. I mean, can we really confirm that Sebastian was pierced by all these arrows? It's hard to say, but that did not discourage the faithful from finding comfort in these tales. And there's perhaps no better example of this than that of St. Christopher. So this beautiful engraving from 1521 by the German artist Albrecht Dürer is one of many printed images featuring the saint that circulated in the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe. Christopher, sadly, has been demoted from sainthood. Apparently his story, they couldn't prove it was real. So he's actually not a saint, but it didn't stop him from being incredibly popular. He was the popular saint of travelers, boatmen, and pilgrims. And even today, you know, sometimes if you take a cab, you might see an image of St. Christopher hanging from the windshield. So he's still kind of around. So according to his legend, Christopher, a strong giant-like figure, helped shepherd travelers across a dangerous river. And one day he was approached by a small child who wanted to cross. So as they traversed the water together, Christopher noticed the child growing heavier and heavier on his shoulder. And when they got to the shore, the child revealed his true identity as Jesus. So hence the saint's name, Christopher, or Christ bearer. So you may be wondering, what does such a sweet image have to do with death? Well, travel in the early modern period, while it was becoming more and more common with trade, with pilgrimage, exploration to new lands, it could be a very dangerous enterprise, and it often came with the risk of death. Early modern Europeans, at least Catholics, believed that looking at an image of St. Christopher saved the viewer from sudden death that day. And that was a fate to be avoided at all costs because it meant you died without last rites. Another printed image in Augustana's collection, a scene of a child being suddenly whisked from his home and family by the skeletal figure of death, highlights this fear of death without notice. And this is a page, it was designed by the German artist Hans Holbein the Younger, and it comes from one of these very popular books that were printed during this time period called The Dance of Death. And basically they focused on this idea that you can be a child, you could be a king, you could be a priest, death will come for us all. So images of St. Christopher could perform a talismanic function. So my own research has explored the arts of domestic devotion in Renaissance Venice. And I've thus scoured hundreds of the city's household inventories from the 16th century. St. Christopher was one of the most popular saints featured in the printed, painted, and sculpted images that Venetians owned, which makes a lot of sense for a city of merchants that is surrounded by water. These pictures were placed right by the doorway that led in and out of the house, similar to Christopher's placement by the doorways of churches along the Alpine pilgrimage routes of Europe, making the figure of this purported saint the last image Venetians would have seen as they crossed the threshold and ventured out to the dangers of the world. And it's quite possible that they may have even owned this particular image by Dürer, because there were multiple copies made and the Venetians collected art by Albrecht Dürer. So printed images like this one meant that more individuals could protect themselves from harm and the terror of sudden death. As Holbein image demonstrates, young or old, rich or poor, all are subject to the great equalizer of death. So we move from some more personal images to something with a kind of grander theme. History painting. History painting was considered to be the most elevated of art forms because it drew on noble stories of the past. History painting flourished during the neoclassical period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Neoclassicism was a revival of not just the styles of ancient Greek and Roman art and architecture, but also the themes of heroism and civic duty that dominated the art and literature of this earlier period. Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii epitomizes the neoclassical revival in painting. The fame of the painting prompted numerous reproductions, including this 1815 charcoal drawing, now at Augustana. The ancient Roman story that the work depict, or both works actually depict, is one of tragedy and honor. The cities of Rome and Alba had long been at war, and to finally settle this, they sent 3 warrior brothers from the Horatii and Coriatii families, respectively, to finally decide the victor. On the left, the 3 Horatii brothers from Rome stand rigid, angular, and determined to defend their city's honor as they swear an oath to their father and on their weapons to triumph or die for Rome. Their masculine heroism is contrasted with the right half of the composition, occupied by Sabina, and so she was a woman married to a Horatii and the sister of a Coriatii, and Camilla, who was engaged to a Coriatii and the sister to the Horatii. So they serve as a visual and iconographic foil to the men. They're slumped, rounded, mournful. They are immobilized by their grief over death, as they will inevitably lose a loved one in battle. And it turns out the Horatii were the victors, only the youngest son survived. So the original painting and its copy present in clear, even stark terms, the contrast between the bravery of a noble death and service to one's country, and the emotional anguish that the living must bear. Louis Giraudeau de Roussy-Triosson, better known just as Giraudet, was a pupil of Jacques-Louis David, and there are traces of his mentor's neoclassical style in this painting, The Burial of Attila from 1808. So Augustana owns an oil-on-canvas copy of Giraudet's original work. That's what you see on the left. Here. The subject of the painting and the mood surrounding the work, while the kind of style has some of that tightness of neoclassicism, the mood is certainly tinged with romanticism. Romanticism emerged in the early 19th century and emphasized emotion and subjectivity over the rationalism of the neoclassicism and Enlightenment. Tragic deaths were thus common themes in romantic art and literature. Giraudet's painting depicts the closing scene of a popular novella called Attila, written by the French Romantic writer François-René Chateaubriand. The story is set in what was then the wilds of North America, which Giraudet emphasizes in his painting, with views of a lush landscape in the foreground and beyond the arched rock formation. Attila, a Christian, falls in love with Chactas, seen on the left, a Natchez Native American who is actually the narrator of Chateaubriand's story. Because she has taken a vow of chastity on her mother's deathbed, Attila consumes poison rather than surrender to her passions for Chactas. The hermit priest Aubrey, on the right, informs them too late, so after she's consumed the poison, that this vow was actually not required by God. So it was all in vain. So Giraudet envisions the final scene of this tragic death with the priest carrying Attila to her grave. The artist emphasizes Attila's innocence by her pale skin and white clothing, along with a crucifix just visible in the background that illuminates her. So that's what you see back here. Chactas succumbs to his grief and clutches the feet of his beloved, unlike the heroism displayed by the Horatii brothers. Through curving forms, the use of dramatic lighting, and an emphasis on the landscape, Giraudet and his successor, who painted Augustana's version, crafts a work centered around love and premature death and intended to tug at the heartstrings of its viewer. Another romantic artist featured in Augustana's collection is William Blake. As both a poet and an artist, Blake is perhaps best known for writing, illustrating, and printing his own illuminated book series. This English Romantic artist also illustrated the works of other poets, including The Grave, a 767-line poem by Robert Blair, first published in 1743. And it grew in popularity over the course of the 18th and the early 19th century, thanks in part to Blake's illustrations. It kind of made the book more popular. And so this is an image from the 1813 edition. An exemplar of what came to be known as graveyard poetry, The Grave offers a gloomy meditation on death as the frightening leveler of all. But Blake provides some bright spots. In Death's Door, Blake combines two figures that he had separately drawn and engraved before, along with a verse that reads, "'Tis but a night, a long and moonless night. We make the grave our bed, and then we're gone." The bent, almost decrepit man entering the darkness of the tomb to eternal sleep, and the radiant, strong, awakening, youthful male atop it are what Blake termed contraries, two opposing conditions of the human soul. The juxtaposition of these contrasting figures thus collapses earthly time and visualizes mortality and immortality simultaneously. The old man entering the tomb is an image of the inevitability of death, while the gleaming emerging youth represents the same man's immortal soul once past. Interestingly, Blake's image of Death's Door had such an impact on the later poet Walt Whitman that Whitman abandoned his plans for a more traditional in-ground burial. He instead designed a granite mausoleum inspired by the image. And I just kind of find it interesting because one of the lines from his poem, Leaves of Grass, that I recall from having to read it in high school is, "I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles." But he ended up not, opting for that kind of burial. So as Blake's print and Whitman's tomb suggest, art has often been used as a way not just to grapple with death, but to surpass it. We see this in the lithographic print aptly titled Immortalité, or Immortality, by French artist Ignace-Henri Jean Fantin-Latour. Fantin-Latour, who is loosely associated with the Impressionists, is best known for his floral still life paintings, but towards the later part of his career, he fell under the influence of the Symbolists. So Symbolism was an international avant-garde art and literary movement. As the name suggests, these artists use symbols to express ideas, emotions, and the inner world over realistic representation and the objective, quasi-scientific manner embodied in Impressionism. During his symbolist phase, Fantin-Latour executed a series of allegorical compositions honoring artistic genius and its relationship to immortality. In the 1898 lithograph that first appeared in the publication L'Instant Moderne, the winged personification of immortality hovers between flight and landing and harkens back to images of both Christian angels and ancient Greek figures of victory. She gently raises a palm of triumph and enduring fame in one hand, while the other scatters flowers, a common symbol of beauty and the fleetingness of life. The soft application of a greasy crown, common for lithography, creates a hazy, dreamlike atmosphere typical of the evocative imagery of the symbolist movement. This particular image is likely based on Fantin-Latour's earlier oil painting, Immortalité à Eugène Delacroix, exhibited in the 1889 Paris Salon, where a similar winged figure of immortality disperses flower petals on the grave of Eugène Delacroix, an artist whom Fantin deeply admired. And it's very hard to make out, but there actually is Delacroix's name painted in the lower left-hand corner. These images celebrate art's capacity to bypass death by outliving its maker and audiences. And interestingly, as I mentioned to you, this lithograph actually appeared in a publication, L'Instant Moderne, or Modern Prints, and it appeared next to a poem, a French translation of a verse by William Shakespeare, which is all about proclaiming poetry's ability to surpass any physical monument of commemoration. So I have the translation here, but it seems to almost be this kind of rivalry of art forms, which is the more enduring, the more immortal of the two. Even though portraits typically are created from life, so an artist painting from a living person, they often have had associations with death by serving as a means of commemoration and token of remembrance. The famous Renaissance philosopher and art theorist Leon Battista Alberti said in the 15th century, quote, "Painting contains a divine force, which not only makes the absent present, as friendship is said to do, but moreover make the dead seem almost alive," end quote. About a century and a half later, the Catholic reformer Gabriele Pagliolotti acknowledged the power of a portrait of a relative or friend, quote, "so as to make good the hurt of his absence by means of the presence of a picture," end quote. The portrait miniature was a particularly apt art form for fulfilling such functions. Small, delicate watercolor on ivory paintings, most portrait miniatures are only a couple inches in height, and they would tend to assume an oval shape to enable placement in locket-like containers, protected under glass sometimes. Such a format allowed the image of an individual to be carried or worn, a keepsake always present with a loved one. And in these examples here, you can see loops at the top, which would mean they could be attached to a chain or perhaps even onto clothing. Portrait miniatures grew in popularity in Europe and the US in the 18th and early 19th centuries, a period that witnessed a growing cultural emphasis on romantic love, marriage, and affection between parents and children. This portrait miniature of an unknown child at Augustana from the early 19th century is about just 3 inches high. It is slightly unusual with its rectangular contour, indicating that it was perhaps displayed on a shelf, tabletop, or mantelpiece, very similar to the way that we, in American homes today, display family photos. It is likely, however, that the portrait represents a deceased child. As in the 19th century, the closed bloom of flowers signaled death, and sweet peas, which are represented here, were associated with departures. The intimate, highly personal portrait miniature could represent joy, but also bereavement in a period of still relatively high child mortality rates. The growth of child-centric families made the loss of offspring harder to bear and contributed to the miniature's use as a token of mourning. The next 2 examples I have also deal with the trauma of a loss of a child, so I'm sorry for the downer. They do take different formats though. The early 20th century brought 2 world wars in addition to a global pandemic, so death was an ever-present fact of daily life. There were an estimated 85 to 115 million deaths worldwide with the 2 world wars. These tragic events took art in new directions as European artists explored innovative styles to both grapple with the brutality of the wars and provide a means of escape. Kati Kalwitz, a prolific German printmaker and sculptor and one of the leading artists of the German Expressionist movement, experienced the horrors of war firsthand. Both of her sons served in the First World War, and her younger son, Peter, was killed in action in Belgium in 1914 at the age of 18. But even before the loss of her son, Kalwitz explored maternal loss and grief in her art. Death, Mother, and Child, an etching in dry point from 1910 is one such example. And this is the image that Kai had referenced that kind of got me thinking about our collection as a source for this talk. So the print looks back to her eldest son Hans's bout with diphtheria in 1908, and it seems to anticipate her youngest child's future death in the war. Kalwitz exploited the materials and methods of printmaking to create raw, emotional imagery that touches upon both universal experiences of loss and her specific family, time, and place. In the print, a mother grasps her dying child. So this is her hand here. Crossed hatch lines and the monochromatic gray tones of the printed medium merge the mother's head with her child, and it seems to kind of merge both horizontally and vertically across the right-hand side of the image. And it creates what looks to be a single face. To the left, thin light strokes barely suggest the child's legs and naked lower body. So these are the legs here. So they're very sketchy. They almost suggest this state of forming, of becoming, but also disappearing at the same time. More sinister, and it's hard to see, but is Death's skull here in the left-hand corner. The skeletal arm reaches under the child's stomach, here, to take the child away from his mother. But her grip is so adamant, even ferocious, the viewer wonders who will win. Even if death ends up the victor, Kollwitz makes clear that death can never extinguish a mother's love and devotion to her child. The rough, sketchy quality of the etching evokes an image that is simultaneously haunting and tender, an image that suggests both parting and fusion, and so aptly captures the profound grief of losing a child. The loss of a child is also the central theme of these sculpted wooden figures created by Yoruba artists, probably sometime in the early 20th century. So the Yoruba, who live primarily in Nigeria, they are one of the most populous ethnic groups in Africa, and they also have some of the highest rates of twins in the world. The Yoruba believe twins to be the children of Shango, the god of thunder and lightning, and that they possess supernatural powers to bring good fortune. Multiple births, however, also lead to higher infant mortality. Iriabeji are Yoruba memorials to a twin or twins who have died. So the word Iri means sacred figure, and Abeji means twins or tunis. They typically range in size from a few inches to about a foot in height. And so these two in our collection, this one over here is maybe 6 feet high, and the one on the right-hand side is closer, not 6 feet, sorry. I said that, not 6 feet, 6 inches. And then the one next to it is about 10 inches high. And I should point out, they were made by different artists, probably at different times. But there are some stylistic qualities that are just typical of Yoruba art. So although Iriabeji represent deceased infants or children, the carvers of these sculptures show them as adults in the prime of their life. And there's generally, in Yoruba art in general, there's usually a great emphasis placed on the head. The Yoruba believe that that is the site of the ori, or one's kind of essence, their personality. So you often find that the head will be about 1/3 of the proportion of the rest of the figure, 1/3 of the height. So to ensure the well-being of the living twin and appease the spirits of the deceased, family members care for these sculpted figures. The statues are bathed, rubbed with oil, clothed and adorned. Owners often rub indigo into the elaborate and exaggerated coiffures as a way to calm the spirit's inner being. And in fact, this one, it's hard to tell in this image, but there is indigo that has been rubbed into the coiffure. They may be carried by the mother like a real child or kept in the family's altar dedicated to the twin. These statues are not only a way for living family members to maintain a connection with a deceased child and appease and honor their spirit, they also provide a tangible mechanism by which a family can cope with grief. The last example I want to show you today isn't about childhood, but it certainly deals with loss perceived to be just as tragic and unnecessary. Contemporary artist David Moreno combines image, found materials, and text in his art to create works that are both visual and auditory. In his untitled piece from 1991, hundreds of unburnt, upside-down matchsticks are tightly packed in rows to create patterns of verticals and horizontals across what appears from a distance to be a painted canvas. Strips of text cross the rows of matches, and a diaphanous film of silk envelops the entire work. Despite working with disparate found materials, Moreno creates a uniform visual field in their arrangement. The text that you see across comes from an 1852 publication by Jones Quain. It's titled, and this is an abbreviated title, Series of Anatomical Plates with References and Physiological Comments, and it has a much longer, complex title. But basically this book describes the various body systems and dissections of them. When Moreno made this work, the art world had witnessed profound loss as a result of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The work is a response to the exploding fear of the AIDS crisis, combined with a standstill in terms of medical and political progress. The potentially combustible medium symbolizes the tensions brewing in American society. The text connects each matchstick, suggesting the individuals affected by the disease and its rapid spread and combustibility once lit. The kindling, combined with the autopsy-like description of the brain and the skull, that's the text that's being described here, Combined represent the dormant energy of the human body as well as its fragility. As interpreted recently by one of my students, Luke Furukawa, the piece represents both the anxiety and anger the epidemic aroused in the American public and the power and hope of the indomitable human spirit, even in the face of death. So the relationship between art and death changes with varied belief systems, differing social values, and advancements in technology. Yet throughout history and across cultures, artists reflect and shape how societies mourn, remember, and process death. The inevitability of death has made it a common subject of art, but in some instances, art has been used as a means to outlast death and possibly even bypass it. In many cultures, artistic objects have accompanied the soul in the afterlife to navigate the transition between the realms of life and death. Art can also be used as a tangible means to continue to connect with and remember a loved one after they have passed. From honor and ritual to trauma and protest, art has always been, and I imagine will continue to be, a necessary part of death, as art, like death, is what makes us human. Thank you. Yeah, are there questions? Yeah?
In your time in Venice,
Yeah.
was the Mardi Gras mask sort of thing had anything to do with death?
Oh, well, you know, so you do see those plague masks are everywhere in Venice. So, I mean, there's mask shops all over the place. And a lot of them sell those plague masks, which plague doctors did actually wear. And they would fill them with, like, scents, things that would help mask the odor of what they, yeah.
And is there any Halloween sort of?
Halloween in Venice, they did have some, because I was there in the fall a couple times, but Venice is kind of a weird place now because it's mostly tourists, and so, I mean, there are some kids, but you don't, the Italians are starting to, and I think Europeans in general are starting to adopt a lot of these American holidays. But November 1st is a holiday.
Right.
Yeah, yes. All Saints Day is absolutely a holiday there, yeah.
The Dias de Muertos.
Mm-hmm, exactly, yeah. Other questions?
Well, the Dias de Muertos, did you have any Mexico or?
Well, yeah, it would be appropriate for this time of year, right? I was focusing, we didn't have anything specifically in our collection that connected with that. So that's why I didn't include it, but that's obviously another great example of this connection between art and death, and another interesting tradition, for sure.
I wonder if it came out of the Spanish background or the Catholic background, or if it is more Aztecs.
I think maybe others in the room know more about that tradition, but I think that there is a kind of combination of different traditions that influence that, yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Jackson.
So many of these pieces have like skeletons, bringing a lot of children, in fact. Do you know when like this kind of theme first occurred?
Like children and death?
More
or
of
just the
skeleton grabbing.
Well, I mean, I just think it's just a common image associated with death that, like, even though dissections and sort of our more kind of anatomical understanding of the body doesn't really start to emerge until, I think, I don't know, like more like the Renaissance, but, people would have seen, this sounds gross and morbid, but like corpses, I'm sure, were probably a fact of life, which we don't really experience now, it's like the body is whisked off. But I think people probably had to deal with dead bodies, maybe even decaying bodies, more than we have to encounter today. So I just think that there's kind of a natural connection, because that Mayan plate looks like a skeleton, and so I'm sure there were associations with skeletons, and I mean there's a whole with Christianity and the Middle Ages, we've been talking about relics in our class, but just this like need to hang on to the remains of the deceased too. So yeah, just interesting connections with bodies and corpses. Yeah. Yeah, Leslie.
Do you see any trend or school in modern art that incorporates this kind of symbol?
I mean, I think with like more contemporary artists, it's just, you know, there's a lot of artists who are dealing with like police brutality, and, you know, just the unnecessary deaths of, so kind of using art more as to raise awareness about social justice and unnecessary deaths. So I would say, like, I don't know if it's maybe more common, but it's so, yeah. So, and artists are going to deal with it in their own different ways. There's a lot of artists who deal with, you know, illness, cancer, right? There's just so many different ways that may come from their more personal experiences. So, yeah.
I think of the Grateful Dead. Their stuff, symbolism was always something else.
Yeah. Other questions?
On the Book of Hours, was
Yeah.
a lot of very bright and happy colors.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if across culture or time there's trends with death and the use of color.
Mm-hmm.
Because often, like when we make posters now, like my students will be like, "Oh, this is a bad theme, so we're gonna make dark colors." So is that a modern concept, or is that more about do you have a sense?
Well, I think a lot of that had to do, like with the Books of Hours, yeah, you have gold leaf, you have the use of ultramarine, which was made from lapis lazuli. So that was like one about as expensive as gold. So I think a lot of that color and the brightness of the color had to do more with wealth and showing off wealth than it necessarily symbolized something. I mean, obviously red is a good color to use for blood, but but I don't know if it really, like, the symbolism of, I mean, there's certainly across cultures different associations with color and death, right? Like in some cultures you might wear white rather than black, which Americans tend to wear at funerals. So there is some of that in terms of color symbolism. Yeah.
Do you think Queen Victoria and that whole Victorian mourning that she brought really affected our modern day concepts of mourning and death?
Yes. I actually had a student a few years ago write an amazing senior inquiry topic on that, paper on that very topic. So how Queen Victoria shaped mourning culture. And she made her own mourning dress based on patterns that go back to the time of Queen Victoria. So yeah, she explored that topic, and yes, it was very, because we also, this is a time when just people's access with Queen Victoria was like more, she was just kind of a more popular figure, like in the public eye a little bit more through newspapers and things like that. So she certainly influenced the culture of mourning. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Don't want to cut off any questions, but I do want to put in a plug for the next couple of sessions, but also we're not going to let you get away without some thanks. But first, if you'd like to continue the conversation, you're welcome to do that here, thanks to our friends from the library. Next week, we're going to have a poet from Augustana, Rebecca Wee, take a look at the way poets have viewed death. And then I hope you'll also come 2 weeks from today. Dr. Adam Call talks about the sociology of death. And when we were talking about these ways of keeping people around, you'll learn about a culture that exists today where the deceased lives with the family for a year. You might want to come back and check out that one and learn more about it. But until then, I hope you'll join me in thanking our presenter today, Dr. Margaret Morse.